You're listening to The Economist Asks. I'm Anne McElvoy, and this week we're asking, is the battle to conquer coronavirus like a war? Armed forces have been mobilised to fight a new global enemy, unlike any faced in modern times. Yet as armies grapple with the pandemic on the ground, geopolitical jostling continues unabated. My guest is the head of the British Armed Forces, General Sir Nick Carter. Chief of the Defence Staff, he's the most senior uniformed military advisor to the government. He served in Germany during the Cold War, during the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland too, and commanded troops in Bosnia and Kosovo, as well as tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he was deputy commander of the NATO mission. General Sir Nick Carter, welcome to The Economist Asks.
No, thanks, Anne. It's very good to be with you.
You've described the Army's mobilisation against coronavirus in the UK as the single greatest logistical challenge of your career, and that's a career that's been spent in incredibly difficult theatres of warfare. So give us a sense, if you could, of the scale and nature of this challenge and why it's different.
Well, I think it's different because so much of the way that government is organised is on the basis of being as efficient as possible. And therefore, all of our logistics systems tend to be what they call leaned out. So when you're confronted by something where you have to have a massive increase in the demand signal for customers, whether that's hospitals or individual practices. In the case of the NHS, that of course is a massive expansion of the logistic effort. And when you then consider that you've got to have much more complicated supply chains that make all of that happen, that's why I described it as being the single greatest logistic challenge that I've come across in my career, and that includes both Gulf Wars.
You're one of the few people who've seen the Five Eyes security report that suggested China covered up this outbreak and indeed may have made it worse by its early lack of cooperation. I mean, what do you conclude from the reports that you're seeing?
I think it's unhelpful at this stage to have a witch hunt. I think what we've got to focus on is how we prevent this from happening in the future. Ultimately, we need to be able to work together to solve the problem. A witch hunt is not going to exactly encourage teamwork.
I mean, a witch hunt suggests that there's nothing to find. I mean, a witch hunt is a phrase used when one doesn't particularly want to go and find something.
Well, personally, I've seen no evidence of this being a deliberate act by anybody or it coming from a particular mistake from anywhere either.
So when Mike Pompeo says there's evidence, enormous evidence, he said the virus initiated the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the US intelligence community would appear to be quite divided on this issue. You know, one of the things that you have to do, I suppose, is kind of weigh up different forms of intelligence and come to your own view. I know you're not exactly going to read out classified intel, sadly for us, on the show, but where, well, yeah, I don't put you in an impossible position on that, General, but where do you come down on that kind of question?
My perspective is that I have personally seen no evidence that it emerges from any deliberate act or mistake by any government. And my own view is that what we've now got to do is to work out globally how we prevent this sort of thing from happening again.
And how would you do that?
It comes down to a global conversation, and those at the moment tend to best be had probably in UN circumstances or through the G20 or however it might be. But at the end of the day, I think that's got to be the conversation. And we've had 5 pandemics now since the year 2000. They've all emerged from different places. And those pandemics are going to get worse unless we find a way of genuinely resolving them.
What about disinformation and misinformation about the virus? I think you mentioned at a daily briefing that you gave not long ago that the so-called 77 Brigade is working with the Cabinet Office, so with the heart of government, to help quash rumours about misinformation. This is something not peculiar to the UK, a lot of concern about disinformation and misinformation in the United States and in the other democracies. How practical is it to combat that kind of threat, given that it's very disaggregated? It's simply about where people go to get information.
So, it may sound a bit pedantic, but I think you have to distinguish between disinformation and misinformation. And of course, misinformation will come from, people who may have got scams going, conspiracy theorists and jokers and all the rest of it. And a lot of what our 77 Brigade has been doing in support of the Cabinet Office has been after misinformation and finding misinformation and then getting other parts of government or indeed the media to call them out.
But that in itself sounds, I mean, to some people that would sound like something, one, that they won't be very much aware that it's something called the 77 Brigade and what it does. And it does sound quite secretive. Can you throw a bit of light on how it works?
it is something that we created not for this purpose. It's something that was created for battlefields, when, of course, increasingly the information dimension of what we do on battlefields is becoming really important. And essentially, we would use it in an environment like, say, Afghanistan, to be able to connect to the population, or indeed to the outside world, to get the message across that perhaps one might in the past have described as propaganda, but is actually much more about getting to the truth of things.
So would you get involved in something like the disinformation about 5G and the allegations were floating around quite prolifically on social media that it had something to do with the outbreak of coronavirus in the UK?
It'd be much more about identifying that there was a story going on and then giving it to others at the political level to sort out for themselves. It would be inappropriate for the military to be involved in propaganda at home, if you could put it like that. A capability that was designed for the battlefield, has advantages at this level, but that's not the way we're going to use it. It's about identifying challenges for others to solve.
You're very closely involved in debates about the future of NATO and how it should work in future as a defensive alliance. But even that kind of argument has been reshaped by the pandemic. We've seen countries collaborating on joint vaccine funding pledges, absolutely huge $8 billion commitment organised by the European Union, in this case with pledges from Japan, Canada, Australia. But the US was absent. And I guess that brings us to the question of where we see the role of the United States in this persistent defence alliance of NATO and what will it mean for the future?
There's been absolutely no question of the US being right at the heart of all of the NATO activity that we've been involved in over the last 2 to 3 years. They were very much at the heart of the new NATO military strategy that was published last year. And they're very much at the heart of the work that we're now doing to take the NATO military strategy to its next level. So I don't see any evidence of doing anything different there.
And what do you expect then from the European Union or from our allies in Europe, particularly our big traditional military ally is France, but also to an extent Germany? And I know you've worked very, very hard on that sort of Anglo-German relationship in the military sphere. And yet there's a sense that it's piecemeal, isn't it? It's every country for itself.
Well, I think there have been some indications of people working together. The Prime Minister chaired a global meeting to talk about the vaccine, finding a vaccine is something that is going to require all of us to put our shoulder to the wheel. I also think we're beginning to coalesce about thinking about vulnerable countries, because we're not going to be able to solve the problem of all the vulnerable countries in particularly the developing world unless we do that on a team basis. And I'm absolutely certain that we share common ground with, for example, Germany and France in trying to get after that, and we will do it in a united way. Because these vulnerable countries will remember who helped them in times of crisis.
What about the response of Donald Trump? It somewhat veers from the desultory to sometimes perhaps to the eccentric in his own response and suggestions about how to deal with coronavirus. Does that worry you?
No, I'm not sure it does. I think when you talk to the American machine and everything that's happening with the United States, we still continue to have the sorts of conversations that I think you'd hope would be had about how we are going to get after this challenge.
But it must be at some level, as you have deep military ties with the US, but we have also seen a pretty disaggregated response in the US, and it is obviously such a major player in any argument or any debate about where the international system goes next. So when you're sitting down there with your opposite number, with the most senior commanders in the US, what are you asking for?
I'm regularly talking to my US opposite number at the moment, Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. We have a close relationship, as do our militaries. And he sees it in much the same way I do, that, this is going to be a problem that is a global problem that needs to be solved globally. He sees it very much from a perspective of, what the US can do to lead the Western world through this. So I'm confident from a military perspective. He sees it in exactly the same way that I've been describing it.
What impact would you say the pandemic is having in terms of the global outlook of what we might call bad or dangerous actors? You gave an interview, I think, towards the back end of last year, emphasising how much kind of cyber activity we were seeing, hostile cyber activity from Russia. I think there was a recent event on about March the 11th, when NATO jets had to scramble to intercept Russian planes off the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. I mean, how frequently is this sort of thing going on?
I think sort of every week to 2 weeks. I don't see any diminution in the sort of activity that we've seen over the last year and a half to 2 years at all. But then equally, we're also doing what we do, and we've got an operation come exercise going on off the northern coast of Norway at the moment, and we've still got people exercising in parts of Europe, particularly in Estonia, where we have a battle group at the moment. So neither the Russians, or for that matter NATO, are really taking their foot off the gas. In general terms, I think the level of effort and activity is not far off what we normally would expect to see.
And the National Cybersecurity Centre here in the UK advised recently, jointly with the Department of Homeland Security in the US, over so-called advanced persistent threat actors, groups exploiting the pandemic to get access to information, to intellectual property, to targeting pharmaceutical companies, among others. Is this something that you're seeing arising specifically related to the context we're in of COVID-19? Where are the threats mainly coming from?
I think they come from the usual places that we have noticed in the past, and of course, where you have a crisis.
Yeah, that's a bit mysterious to those of us who are not sitting around the table with the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, I think it's more of our authoritarian political opponents who want to have a go at us, and one of the things that's playing out, isn't it, with this coronavirus thing, is there's a bit of a competition, isn't there, between whether authoritarian is the right answer, or the sort of Western liberal democratic ideals that we stand for is going to be the best way of solving this problem. And of course, what disinformation does, doesn't it, is to try to play to existing divides. And I think that's what you see playing out here.
And more so in the virus than previously, or at about the same level?
I don't have any evidence to say it's greater, but I think the virus does force people perhaps to, as you and I are now doing, as it were, to be at home doing things in a digital way. So the answer is that it is an obvious opportunity for those who would continue to wish to make mischief and spread disinformation.
Let's look to what this means for the so-called global ceasefire. The UN was bidding for that and suggesting that would be one positive response to the coronavirus pandemic globally. The US countered that it could restrict the pursuit of terrorists in Iraq. What is your view of the usefulness of this rather sweeping idea of a global ceasefire in the main conflicts that are haunting the world?
I mean, the challenge, of course, is that, that's something that would probably might be signed up to some states. But of course, so much of the challenges in this world are from non-state actors. And the extent to which Daesh or its affiliated organisations, ISIS as others prefer to call it, are going to sign up to a ceasefire, I remain doubtful about. I'm certain they might have to limit some of their activities because the virus will be a problem for them in the same way it is for everybody else. But I don't see any diminution in their ambition, certainly, to continue to make mischief.
General Sir Nick Carter, thank you very much for joining us.
No, thanks, Anne, very much.
This interview is from our show, The Economist Asks, and every week we publish a new episode in which we interview key figures in world events. The link opposite will take you to a page with all of our previous episodes. Thanks for watching.